want you to understand something this morning. God's timing is not our timing. We live in a world that's used to instant gratification. We want what we want, and we want it now. But God doesn't work on our clock. He doesn't punch in and out at the hours we've set. No, God operates on his divine calendar, where every second, every moment, every delay is part of a much larger picture. We often find ourselves caught in the trap of trying to align God's timing with our own. It's as if we think that if we've planned something, God should automatically step in and make it happen according to our schedule. But God's timing doesn't work the way we expect. In fact, his timing is often quite different from ours, and this is something we must understand deeply if we are going to walk in faith. Divine timing is not our timing, and this truth should be a foundation for how we live and trust in the unfolding of God's plans for our lives. When we think of time, we think in terms of minutes, hours, days, and years. We have deadlines, appointments, and schedules. Time is something we measure and control. We know when something is due, and we expect that things should happen within those parameters. But with God, time operates on a different level. His understanding of time isn't bound by the same limits that we experience as human beings. He operates outside the constraints of what we can see or understand. God exists in eternity, and what may seem like a delay or an unanswered prayer to us is merely a moment in his perfect timeline. Think about how often we jump ahead of God. We pray, we ask, and we expect an immediate response. We want things to happen quickly because we live in a fast-paced world. And when we don't see results right away, we start to question if God has heard our prayers. We wonder, why is this taking so long? Why isn't it happening yet? But the reality is that God sees the full picture, while we only see fragments. What we don't realize is that the waiting process is just as important as the answer we're waiting for. God's timing is perfect even when it feels like it's late. In fact, God's lateness is often an illusion created by our own limited perspective. We may feel that something should have happened by now, but God is always working behind the scenes. Every event, every encounter, every season of life is part of a much grander story that we cannot fully grasp. While we think we're ready for something, God knows that there are still lessons to be learned, character to be developed, and faith to be strengthened before that blessing can manifest. Look at the stories of the people in the Bible. Abraham was promised a son, but he had to wait for years. The Israelites were promised the promised land, but they wandered in the desert for decades. Jesus himself waited until the fullness of time to be born, and he didn't begin his ministry until he was 30 years old. Imagine if any of them had forced God's hand or taken matters into their own hands. Abraham could have taken shortcuts. The Israelites could have skipped the wilderness. Jesus could have rushed his mission. But instead, they trusted in God's timing, knowing that his plan was far better than any solution they could manufacture. God's timing also teaches us to surrender control. We often forget that we aren't the ones in charge of our destiny. We want things on our terms because it feels safer, more predictable. But when we trust God's timing, we acknowledge that he has the ultimate say over every aspect of our lives. It's not just about when things happen, it's about who's in charge of making them happen. And when we see our timeline to God, we We allow him to work things out in ways that are beyond comprehension. So instead of trying to force things to happen or scrambling to align God's timing with our own, we must learn to let go. We must learn to trust that though we may not understand why things aren't happening as quickly as we'd like, God is never too early and never too late. He is always, always right on time. And that timing, though it may test our patience, is perfect in ways we can't even imagine. Patience in the process is one of the hardest lessons we have to learn, especially in a world that encourages instant results and quick fixes. We live in a time where everything seems to move at the speed of light. Answers are a click away. Meals are delivered to your door in minutes. And the expectations of our society urge us to achieve, to succeed, and to arrive at our destinations as quickly as possible. But God doesn't operate like that. His ways are higher than our ways, and his timeline is different from ours. Patience in the process is where true faith is born and where we discover the depth of God's working in our lives. We often ask, why is this taking so long? Why does it feel like nothing is happening? The reality is, the process is just as important as the promise. God knows that it's not enough for us to simply reach our destination. The journey to get there is essential to who we become in the end. God is not just concerned with the outcome. He's deeply invested in the way we grow along the way. In fact, it's often in the waiting, in the season of patience, that God molds our character, refines our faith, and teaches us the value of trusting him in every circumstance. Patience in the process is about learning to trust God when we can't see what's happening. It's trusting him when things feel stagnant, when nothing seems to be moving forward, when it looks like we're stuck. But that's when we have to remind ourselves that God is always at work, even in the silence. Just because we can't see, like a farmer who plants seeds and must wait for them to grow, we have to give God time to do his work. And often, the growth we experience is happening beneath the surface where no one can see, and sometimes not even we can feel it. It's easy to be patient when things are going well, when we're experiencing success and blessings, but it's in the tough moments and moments of struggle where patience is truly tested. It's when we face adversity that we're forced to dig deep into our faith and trust that God is still in control. It's in those moments that our patience becomes a reflection of our belief that God's plan is far greater than anything we can achieve on our own. We have to remind ourselves that even in the waiting, God is doing something in us, refining us, preparing us for something greater that we can't yet see. There's an old saying that goes, good things come to those who wait, but this isn't just a cliche, it's a biblical truth. The Bible talks about how patience develops character and how the testing of our faith produces endurance. The process isn't easy, but it's necessary for what's ahead. If we rush the process, we might miss the lessons we need to learn, or we might try to skip the seasons of growth that equip us for the bigger blessings to come. Patience in the process is not about passivity, though. It's about active waiting. It's about doing the work while you wait, remaining faithful, continuing to walk even when you don't see the end in sight. It's about trusting God with every step, even when the road seems long and uncertain. It's saying, Lord, I believe you are working even when I can't see it. I believe you are shaping me into who I need to be for what's coming next. That's the attitude that makes patience a powerful force, not just a passive endurance. So, as we navigate the process of life, we must hold on to the truth that God is working in us. Patience is not a passive resignation, but an active trust in God's perfect timing. As we learn to endure, to trust, and to grow, we become more equipped for the blessings He has set aside for us. It is not about rushing to the end, but about becoming everything we need to be along the way. Waiting in faith, not frustration, is one of the most challenging yet transformative aspects of the Christian journey. It's easy to say that we trust God when things are going well, but when we find ourselves in seasons of waiting, when the promise hasn't yet been fulfilled, when the prayers seem unanswered, and when the breakthrough feels miles away, that's when our faith is truly tested. The key difference between waiting in faith and waiting in frustration lies in the posture of our heart. It's the difference between enduring the wait with peace, knowing that God is at work, and growing bitter, resentful, or anxious because we don't understand why things are taking so long. When we wait in frustration, we essentially try to take control of the situation ourselves. We begin to question God's timing, doubting that He's hearing us, or worse, doubting His goodness. We might start thinking, why is this happening to me? Why hasn't my breakthrough come yet? Our minds can begin to spiral into worry, impatience, and confusion. Frustration arises when we focus on what we don't have and forget about what God is doing in us during the wait. Frustration comes when we see the waiting period as a wasted time, as a season of inactivity instead of a necessary moment of preparation. But faith, the kind of faith that can endure the long wait, reminds us that the process is just as important as the promise. Waiting in faith requires us to believe in what we cannot see. It's easy to have faith when the evidence is right in front of us, but true faith rises up in the absence of visible signs. Faith believes that God is working, even when we can't perceive His hand at work. It's standing firm on the belief that He has not forgotten you, even if it feels like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. Faith is not passive. It's not about sitting back and doing nothing while we wait. Faith is active. It involves trusting, expecting, and continuing to obey God even when we don't understand what He's doing or when He's going to move. When we wait in faith, we refuse to be moved by what we see or feel. We understand that God's thoughts are higher than ours, His ways beyond our comprehension. We know that while we may be waiting for answers, He is orchestrating the right circumstances, aligning the right people, and positioning us for a greater blessing than we could ever imagine. In those moments when we want to give up, when we want to throw in the towel because the weight feels unbearable, faith whispers, don't stop now. You're closer than you think. God is faithful and His timing is perfect. The difference between waiting in faith and waiting in frustration is also found in the heart's attitude. Frustration turns us inward, focusing on our own desires and needs. But faith shifts our focus outward toward God's glory, toward the bigger picture of His will. We recognize that the wait is not just about our desires being met, but about God's purposes being fulfilled in our lives. When we wait in faith, we know that every moment, even the moments that feel silent or difficult, is an opportunity for God to do something in us that will prepare us for the blessing that's ahead. Faith means refusing to let the frustration of the wait rob us of peace. It means holding on to the truth that God is good, that He is faithful, and that He will bring about His promises in His time, not ours. Waiting in faith allows us to find rest in the assurance that God is in control, even when we don't have the answers we seek. It's the kind of faith that can declare, though I don't see it yet, I know He's working. Though I don't understand why, I trust that His plan is greater than my own. This kind of waiting doesn't diminish us, it strengthens us, refines us, and deepens our relationship with the Father. When we wait in faith, we are choosing to trust God's perfect plan over our own timeline. And that choice, more than anything, is what keeps our hearts anchored in His peace. His ways are higher. These words might sound familiar, but they carry a profound truth that we must learn to embrace. The idea that God's ways are higher than our own isn't just a theological concept. It's a foundational truth that should shape the way we approach every aspect of life. When we look at the events in our lives, the delays, the detours, and the challenges, we often struggle to understand why things aren't happening the way we expected. In those moments, we are invited to lean into the reality that God's understanding is not confined to our human limitations. His ways transcend what we can see or understand, and trusting in that reality is where true peace begins. There's a reason why God's ways are higher. His vantage point is not restricted by time, space, or human understanding. We operate within the confines of what we can see, hear, and experience. But God's perspective is eternal. He is not bound by the limitations that we face. What seems like a setback, a delay, or an unanswered prayer to us may be part of a larger divine orchestration that we cannot yet grasp. We see the pieces of the puzzle, but God sees the completed picture. In the moments when we are overwhelmed by confusion or frustration, we must remind ourselves that God sees the end from the beginning. His plans are far greater than our own, and His wisdom is unfathomable. It's easy to trust God when everything is going according to plan, when doors are opening, when blessings are flowing, and when our prayers are answered quickly. It's easy to claim that we believe in God's sovereignty. But trusting in God's higher ways becomes more difficult when life takes an unexpected turn, when things don't go the way we expected, or when we're faced with disappointment and uncertainty. In those moments, the challenge is not just in what happens, but in how we respond to it. The temptation is to try and force our own way, to take control, or to rush ahead of God's plan. But when we choose to trust that His ways are higher, we surrender the need to understand everything and embrace the peace that comes from knowing that He is in control. When we encounter difficulties, we often have limited understanding of the bigger picture. What seems like a detour or a delay may actually be a divine redirection. God may be preventing us from walking down a path that would have led to harm or disappointment. He may be shaping us in ways that we cannot see, teaching us patience, perseverance, or humility through the process. Every struggle, every unanswered prayer, every moment of waiting is part of a greater purpose that is unfolding according to God's perfect will. We also have to recognize that God's timing is intimately tied to his higher ways. We often want things to happen immediately according to our schedule, but God's timing is never late nor is it early. It is perfect. What we perceive as a delay is simply God setting the stage for something bigger and better than we could have ever imagined. It's in those moments of waiting that we are being prepared for what is ahead. The challenges we face, the struggles we endure, and the waiting periods in our lives are all part of his sovereign plan, designed to mold us and shape us into who we need to be for what he has in store. God's ways are higher not just in the grand scope of life, but in the daily choices we make. When we trust him, we begin to see that his way of doing things is always better than our own. He calls us to walk by faith, not by sight, to lean not on our own understanding, but to acknowledge him in all our ways. As we trust in his higher ways, we begin to experience the peace that comes from surrendering control and allowing God to lead us where we need to go. Even in the moments of uncertainty, we can rest in the assurance that his plan is always for our good and his glory. His wisdom surpasses our understanding, and his ways, though they may seem mysterious at times, are always perfect. The danger of rushing ahead is a real and often overlooked pitfall in our journey of faith. In a world that prizes speed, efficiency, and instant results, it can be incredibly tempting to push things forward, to take matters into our own hands, and to try to force God's plan to unfold on our timeline. But in doing so, we risk stepping out of alignment with God's perfect will, and we may miss the deeper lessons and blessings he has prepared for us along the way. When we rush ahead, we operate on our own agenda, not considering the larger picture that God is crafting for us. We might think we know what's best for our lives, that we have a clear vision of where we're supposed to go, and that the sooner we get there, the better. But God's perspective is far greater than ours, and his understanding of what we need when